of equitable climate solutions from which we all, I mean all of us can benefit, no matter the income, skin color, or zip code. Everyone, please join me in welcoming the pastor of Kingdom Living Temple and the executive director of the New Alpha Community Development Corporation, Reverend Leo Woodberry.
Hey, hi, Sean.
Hey, Reverend, how you
Yes, great to
doing?
be here.
So happy to have you. All right. And last but not least, our guest is a guy that a lot of us kind of already know. Some of you may be in love with. I know I love him. A man who's become a wall smashing hero in Marvel's The Avengers and is currently starring in HBO's drama series, I Know This Much Is True. He's also a personal advocate of more voices, leading the public conversation around climate change, and is the co-founder of the Solutions Project. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Mark Ruffalo. Hey, Mark.
I'm
Hey, Sean. Hey, Elizabeth. Hey, Leo.
Hey,
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 How y'all?
Octavia.
Yes. How you doing today, Mark?
I'm good. My internet's a little spotty, Sean, so might have to bear with me. But I'm glad to be here, man. This has been a long time coming, and I'm so glad to see you having this show and hosting it. It's really exciting and beautiful and needed.
Well, thank you. And it's a joy to have you all. You know, if y'all didn't know, we're still in a quarantine. A pandemic is very real. And so we are all coming to you live from home. So please, accept any technical difficulties that may come up. We're rolling with it, but we're so excited to be pushing forward with this conversation about climate curiosity. Because right now is a moment to be engaged in these kind of conversations. And with that said, it's now time to jump into the news of the week, where we look at the latest headlines making issues. And so earlier this month, Vogue published this amazing article titled "Why Every Environmentalist Should Be Anti-Racist." It's written by Leah Thomas, a Black woman of Generation Z, who is also studying to get her environmental policy degree. In the article, she calls on progressive environmentalists to be as vocal as they are about endangered Black lives, as they are about saving our planet. And now, for weeks now, especially with the COVID pandemic starting, we've been seeing more and more stories come out like this, that are at the intersection of things like race and at climate and COVID. But the conversation is not new, which is why I'm so excited to be having our guest with me today. And, my first question is actually for you, Elizabeth. How are you challenging the climate justice movement to be more anti-racist?
well, thank you for that question. The climate justice movement has always been anti-racist. Many of us started this work because it was our communities that were oversaturated with environmental burdens, with power plants, with waste treatment plants. It was our communities that couldn't breathe. Our communities that have always lived at the intersection of racial injustice and environmental racism, really. And so for us, the climate movement is natural. It's really, we are the descendants of extraction of our land, of extraction of our labor. And so for us, those things are intertwined. We can't separate racial justice from climate change because our communities are the front line of not only the impacts of climate change, but live in the midst of all of these isms. So I think that the distinction is between the climate movement and the climate justice movement, because the climate movement has often talked about conservation, they've talked about open space, they've talked about the trees and the animals, all the things that we care about too. But our struggle started by saving our lives, by the fact that we lived in the middle of it, and it was a racial justice issue. In fact, I started this work doing work against police brutality and racial violence back in the late 80s. And so I pivoted into environmental justice because I realized that if we couldn't breathe, we couldn't fight for justice. So I see those things as completely connected. And I think that our movement is firmly ensconced in all of it, in that connection between who is going to be most impacted by climate change.
Totally. Thank you for that. And Reverend Woodberry, we've had some conversations before this, and we talked a lot about, the ways the environmental movement is really intersected with so many other movements for justice. How, from your vantage point, are you seeing that connection happening more?
Well, as Elizabeth said, we really began this whole struggle of movement. Originally, it was actually called environmental racism before we used the terms environmental justice and climate justice and the rest, because the places where polluting facilities were cited in people of color, black, brown, and indigenous communities. And we immediately saw the intersectionality. I actually came to this movement through a youth mentoring group that we had. And when we moved on to the issue of health for teens, we found out that people had to restrict the amount of fish that they consume because of mercury contamination, because otherwise women of childbearing age and children could have learning development problems. And so from the very onset, we saw race involved with where polluting facilities were sited, what bad air quality did in terms of respiratory problems, the food we ate, mercury contaminated fish, where most of the mercury came from coal-fired plants, etc. And so that's why Executive Order 12898, which was signed by President Clinton, came about, because we knew that there was an intersectionality, and that executive order basically says that we need to look at the environmental impacts on environmental justice communities before anything is built or any actions taken. Out of that came NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, and others. So from the very beginning, our fight has been around saving our lives, dealing with the food that we eat, the water that we drink, etc.
I love that. I love that. And Mark, I'm going to get to you, but as you were talking about Woodberry, you brought out something that I was thinking about, talking about the history of environmental racism and the movement and how that's spread. Has, for either of you, Elizabeth or Reverend Woodberry, have you all seen such kind of a coverage though around this, the way we're seeing now? Like, this article in Vogue, right? I feel like before I've seen a lot from a environmental standpoint, but really, on a mainstream platform. What's that been like as you see kind of this new emergence of environmentalism?
Well, the intersectionality has really become more apparent with COVID-19, because a lot of the people who are most susceptible to getting the virus are the people who live in areas that have food swamps and food deserts, and disproportionately have pre-existing conditions like asthma and hypertension and diabetes and all of those things. And so the public health sector is becoming more and more connected, as it should be, with the environmental and climate justice movement.
So, we have been sounding the alarm for a long time, whether it was with the White House Council on Environmental Quality or with EPA and a lot of the agencies. This movement has been around for a minute. And so it's surprising to us that people are column busting what we, what we have already known. We knew that COVID was going to disparately impact our people, because it's our people with the upper respiratory disease, the asthma, the health disparities, the history of austerity and neglect. It was going to be the people who are most vulnerable that were going to be impacted by COVID. I lost 3 members of my family in 2 weeks, all living in the South Bronx, all Black Puerto Ricans, all living there, and all suffering from all of those underlying health conditions that come with poverty and that come with a history of racism and neglect. So it wasn't a surprise to us. What is really surprising is how long it takes for the mainstream to recognize these disparities and to support the struggle of the front line to pass legislation, to change the landscape, and to invest in communities that have deserved it for generations. That's surprising to us, and for them to act like, oh, we didn't know. No, we've been telling you for a minute. You just didn't hear us. And it took a disease that is taking people out all over the country and is disparately impacting our folks to to make people wake up. We can't continue to wait till it's something that disastrous, because there's going to be more disruption. Climate change is bringing more disruption. So I'm really happy that you're using this platform to elevate this conversation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And I think that's a great segue, to Mark, right? As you're a Hollywood figure, you're an actor, right? But you're still a person, an everyday person who, like all of us, are being affected at these same realities. But I'm wondering for you, how can we leverage this moment, to sustain how to not be anti-racist? Not just in police brutality, but about the environment, about climate, around food. What do you think?
Well, I came to this from the fracking movement, really, and I've had a journey. That was poor and working class whites, and so I jumped into that and fought shoulder to shoulder with them, and that was what I knew. That's where I was living. As time has progressed, I started to move more and more into other frontline communities that were fighting, and it became really clear really quickly that that this was a racial issue as well. That in the communities like in Los Angeles, where they're doing all this drilling, that is Black and brown communities. Where they're doing processing of fossil fuels, Black and brown communities. Where their water is being poisoned, Black and brown communities. Every single area that environmentalism touches a community, you will find Black and brown and poor communities on the front lines. And what was missing from the whole dialogue of the environmental movement, the white environmental movement, was the acknowledgement of people by POC people. We saw an explosion of comprehension and awareness with Standing Rock, and that has only grown over time. But if you go into a community that's ravaged by COVID, you will see three things that are common in every one of those communities: food, poor water, polluted water with PFOA, PFAS, all those chemicals that also deteriorate the body's immunity system. And then you'll see pollution, air pollution. And it's, the way our system is set up, this capitalist system, it is no wonder that at some point there's going to be someone on the bottom. And throughout history, from the very inception of this country, I hate to say it, but it has been the Black and brown and indigenous people who have been on the bottom. And now we're seeing the full-blown manifestation of that, and we're all seeing it. We're living in a time of revelations, and it's being revealed to us the reality of the entire nation, of the people of the entire nation, not just white people, but all of the people. And now we have to make a decision about who we're going to be moving forward. We can't say, "Oh, I didn't know that" anymore. And that's the beauty, and the beauty and the tragedy of this moment we're living in. But that's been my journey, and the more I go deeper and deeper into it, the more I see that unless we're lifting Black and brown and indigenous people, we're sunk. The whole fucking boat is sunk. And if we take care of them, everyone gets taken care
of. Snaps. Now I know y'all heard that, right? Y'all heard that. Listening, I see the comments going off. I thank you for that. I think that's great for people to hear, right? That there is a journey in understanding, whether you are new to the environmental movement or if you've been in the environmental movement for 20 years, right? There is a journey for all of us to continue to learn and to grow together. All right, y'all. Well, that's all the time that we have for looking at the headlines for today. But up next, we're going to jump into our Real Talk segment, talking about justice first. All right, and we're back. And today we're talking to Elizabeth Yeampierre, Reverend Leo Woodberry, and Mark Ruffalo on Climate Curious. Once again, I'm Shawnee Watkins, your host, and Octavia Spiegel is our sign language interpreter. Also, shout out to Devin Edwards. We see you. Thank you for your comment. Thanks to everyone for tuning in and commenting on Facebook, on YouTube. It's a pleasure, and this conversation is really good, really good. So now I want to kick things into the real talk, right? So this week we're talking about justice first, and our conversation's really already been going there, right? As with this year, justice, we can't go anywhere without talking about justice, and rightfully so. And so, Elizabeth, I want to start with you. What does justice first mean to you?
Well, for me, I think that we have a historical responsibility to level the playing field and to take care of the most vulnerable people in our community, particularly those people that are descendants of extraction, of our lands, of our labor, the people who built this country, who are in harm's way. And so justice first means doing that, taking care of the folks that when you hear Black Lives Matter, well, when you take care of Black lives, you take care of everybody else. When you address the issues that Indigenous First Nations people are dealing with, you're taking care of everyone. When you're talking about Puerto Rico, for example, Puerto Rico, which is the oldest colony probably on the face of the earth and has a long history of extraction and neglect, and now has endured so much disaster in the past 2 years, you have to take care of those people who have been put in that situation because of capitalism, because of extraction, because of privilege. And so that's what that means for me, that has to be the priority, that no commitment to addressing climate change can start without us doing that first.
Period. Brazil is in the house. Obrigado
Wow.
a todos. Yeah, I've seen we're pretty live. I've seen Singapore, Egypt. Tudo bem, todo mundo. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that. I think that you said it so beautifully and so poignantly. Thank you. Reverend Woodberry, I want to check to you. So you're the co-creator of the Justice First tour that kicked off in 2018. I've been able to see a lot of the work that you've done, but I would love, for others who are just joining, what was that tour like, and what was your goal, and what were some of the solutions that you've seen come from there?
So absolutely, thank you for that. The original Justice First event was held in December of 2000. It was a small.
Oh no, Reverend Leah, hold on. I think you hit the mute button by accident. And that's okay. We gon' get Reverend Leo back.
He's got it.
Oh, are we back? Okay. So, Mark, I was wondering for you, how do you connect your activism with, your work as an actor? I know most recently you did a film, Dark Waters, that touched on the environmental movement, but how do you really see that connection?
Well, I mean, at first it was using the spotlight and that can sometimes follow me around, and then putting the people that we should be hearing from in it. And then I started to think, okay, well, I have this other platform of storytelling. I want to start bringing those stories. A documentary can go so far, a newspaper article can go so far, but a movie can really go deep into the culture and into people's sympathies. And they when you get into storytelling, a lot of the political ideologies that are separating us right now, those divisions, that you can start to puncture them. You can start to get beneath them. You can start to reach people on the commonality of our human experience, the universality of what it is to be a human, to struggle, to love. What we care about is so similar, our families, our communities. And I really thought that storytelling was a way to transcend some of the political stalemate that's really keeping us from moving forward together. I mean, it's so funny. We're here at each other's necks while these big corporations and the powers that be are just running amok in the world all over us. And we're all suffering. There's no political stripe or belief or opinion that is gonna save you from the catastrophes that we're facing right now. And I thought storytelling was a good way to broach that.
Storytelling is, you're talking to a nerd storyteller, so I'm just like, that's it. It's the power that we're able to see. Okay, I want to jump back to Reverend Leo. I see that you're back, and we were discussing the Justice First tour. So, yeah, tell us more.
Okay, actually, our first event was held in December of 2000 in Florence, South Carolina. It was a small march, and it didn't go very far, basically because at that time in the Southeast, we didn't have a network. Now, a lot of folks, as Elizabeth said, this work's been going on a long time. So in the early 80s, late 90s, there was actually a regional group called the Southern Organizing Committee, and there was also an African American group called the African American Environmental Justice Action Network, and they had both dissolved. So we began to build bridges and connect with people throughout the Southeast. And in 2018, there were a lot of networks by then in the South, and we were able to take the tour to 12 southeastern cities, 12 southeastern states, 25 cities. In addition to that, Wilmington, Delaware, Red Banks, New Jersey, and Yale University. And the entire idea of Justice First is that we should work intersectionally across all issue areas, with the idea being that if we are able to attain justice in any community on any issue, then we have won. And so since that time, after the tour, we've seen groups come together who have never worked together before. So in Virginia and North Carolina, groups have come together who participated in the tour to fight the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. In South Carolina, we have the South Carolina Environmental Justice Network that is working to make 8 cities in the state 100% renewable. In Alabama, in Mississippi, we have groups that have come together to fight the expansion of Enviva, who is building plants so that they're cutting down our forests to convert them into wood pellets, for which there's no market in the United States, but they're selling them in the European Union, also in Asia. And so it's been amazing how people have come together intersectionally. And no better example, even though it's not a direct result of the Justice First tour, is how we see people responding to police brutality and murder across the country and around the world, with no question as to what is your race, what is your gender, what is your sexual orientation, and what are the main issues that we're working on. And only with that kind of solidarity, with that type of unity, will we be able to dismantle a system of racism that has put the entire planet on the brink of extinction. And that intersectionality should not only be among human beings around issues, but also in terms of our relationship with nature as well.
You said it so well, and like my girls, the city girls say, period, because that's it. That's like it's the period on the conversation. I thank you all so much. You've been just sharing so many great things. We've been seeing so many comments. It's amazing. I do want to just real quick. So Elizabeth, I know that you are the director of UPROSE that's here in Brooklyn in Sunset Park, and some of the amazing things that you've done. Obviously, there's been wins that you can talk about getting certain bad energy things shut down. But I also know that you've helped create new solutions for the community, like the new park that was that was created in Sunset Park. I wonder, can you talk to me a little bit about how those pieces fit into climate justice? You know, fresh air, fresh water.
Absolutely. We started by fighting a lot of the environmental burdens, and then we basically pivoted towards envisioning what was possible. And so we built an intergenerational movement of community that doubled the amount of open space in Sunset Park, stopped the siting of a power plant, and just recently launched the first community-owned solar cooperative in the state of New York. And so, so everything from looking, yeah, it's really exciting as we envision what regenerative economies are going to look like in a community like ours. What does that look like in terms of food sovereignty? What does it look like in terms of looking at our rooftops and our backyards and protecting our basically strengthening social cohesion? So we have expanded the medians to make it more walkable for people. We've reduced the amount of PM 2.5 and NOx and SOx in our community to make it more breathable. And we've also we've actually birthed leadership. We've held 8 climate justice youth summits featuring young people of color who are leading on climate change. They were the front line of the People's Climate March in 2014. We sent a young woman to the COP this past year. We've sent 4 young people to Antarctica on scientific expeditions and 3 to the North Pole, all from around the block. Young people from the hood, right? So these young people are really honoring the legacy of frontline leadership from the Black Panthers to the Young Lords to the climate justice movement. And so they see the intersection of racial justice and climate change. They see those connections. They don't have a choice between protecting themselves from bad cops and from a superstorm Sandy. And so those things are all important to them, but they're about solutions. And so I'm really proud of that. Our organization is Women of Color-led organization, made up of a bunch of badasses that do everything from planning to energy democracy, to looking at how you operationalize infrastructure that moves us away from fossil fuel dependency. Those are all the kinds of things that we do in Sunset Park, and we are really proud to be part of a national movement where people all over the country are doing the same.
Thank you. That's I as a Brooklynite, I've been able to experience the work that Elizabeth is talking about firsthand, and it's so uplifting and so inspiring. And I will just one thing, for the new viewers who are watching who may not be involved with the climate movement, the COP is not the cops. The COP is the UN climate change conference that happens every single year. So yeah, just wanted to kind of share that. But no, for sure, exactly. Like these young people are truly innovative. I mean, I've been in a room with them where we were going off singing lyric for lyric with Cardi B's Bodak Yellow, and at the same time, chanting "No justice, no peace." And so, right, I love that. Thank you so much. All right, so we're running on time. I thank you all, but we're going to do a quick little Q&A to see what questions folks out in the audience have for our fabulous guests. Pop that up. Ta-da! Okay. And so our questions are gonna pop up here on the screen. Give me one sec and just double check in with my producer. Okay, you've both led through major disasters, Hurricane Maria, Sandy before that, and the flooding throughout the Southeast. And at the leading edge of community solar, urban-centered rural projects. Reverend Leo and Elizabeth, how do you hold space for both the destruction and the creation that's happening right now? Great question.
It is. It's a complicated question. Thank you for that. So from the Climate Justice Alliance perspective, we have what we call a people-to-people just recovery. That means that we support people on the ground in engaging in what they need to do in order to survive the impacts of disruption, of environmental and climate, like things that would happen in Houston through Hurricane Harvey, what happened in Maria, in Puerto Rico, where you had 23 super funds that literally exploded all over the land and the air and the waterways. But people on the ground had the solutions. They were looking at food sovereignty. They were looking at operationalizing a just transition, moving away from extraction and bringing and taking communities off the grid, providing them with food, water, and the things that they needed. And so we created the spaces to support that work, not to speak for communities, not to supplant local leadership, but to move the money to the front line and support local visions that knew exactly what needed to do so that they could not only survive those disasters, but be put on a path to being able to strengthen their social cohesion for future disasters. In terms of the looking forward, we are looking at how we create regenerative economies. A just transition really is sort of the path, the journey that gets us from moving against fossil fuel dependency to creating the kinds of systems that we need that challenge systems that got us to where we are. Things like patriarchy, racism, capitalism that created the conditions that we're living in right now and that is really feeding climate change, right? Climate change didn't just happen overnight. It is literally the child of colonialism, the child of enslavement, the child of all of that. And so what you're seeing happening all over the country, in New York State, for example, we've got a coalition called New York Renews, made up of literally over 200 organizations trying to make New York State completely free from fossil fuel dependency and investing money in free and frontline communities. On a national scale, we've basically put in language to make sure that the Green New Deal honors frontline struggles and frontline solutions. So from the very local, from Sunset Park to statewide to nationally, there are solutions that are coming from frontline organizations, from communities in Detroit, communities down in Mississippi, folks down in Miami, and people in the Bay,
Buffalo.
people in Indian country. So all of us are working really hard to make sure that we operationalize those solutions, and many of us are already doing that.
Right. So when we look at the South, it's a little bit different, but I think a good example of what's going on in the South is our response that took place after Hurricane Matthew and Hurricane Florence, where we saw that there were communities that were continually being impacted. One such community is in Marion County, South Carolina, a small community called Britain's Neck that has been around since the American Revolutionary War. And there's about 2,000 people there who've been evacuated 3 times in the last 5 years. And so we're currently working on a project that is funded so that we can bring ecotourism to the area. We found that after the flooding, a lot of low-income people and elderly people couldn't afford to connect to the rural water systems. Wells were contaminated with pesticides, herbicides, and other things. So we had to go down and help train the trainers so that people knew how to decontaminate their wells. And with the project we're currently working on, not only are we looking at how do we keep our forests standing, our wetlands intact, because those are natural defenses against flooding, but also how we can mitigate it by raising houses, by putting retaining ponds in that can also stock fish and create what we call engines of economic opportunity, ecotourism. We just got some kayaks that were donated to us, and we're working on those sorts of things. But, what we're looking at, and I agree completely with Elizabeth, that these solutions have to come from the communities. They have to come from the ground. And so we're also involved right now with Dogwood Alliance, the Southeast Climate and Energy Network, as well as New Alpha Community Development Corporation, and other organizations in conducting a survey and a study in all 12 southeastern states to see what are the specific policy needs that should go into a Green New Deal or similar legislation. And so it's different in several places. It's different in rural areas. So, for example, we were in Southeast Georgia, in the Albany area, where farmers are losing their land consistently because of flooding. And some of it could be mitigated simply by shovel-ready jobs. We had people tell us that the ditches in their community had not been cleaned out in 20, 25 years. And so we're working diligently on climate-led solutions, community-led climate solutions. But I want to lift off this point. Whatever comes out of Washington or the states in terms of policy, we must make sure that resources reach the people on the ground. That means forming things like community action agencies where federal dollars go directly to groups in communities who are leading the efforts. And without doing that, we'll also have always have outsiders telling people in communities most impacted what is best for them. But loads of solutions. I mean, we've done a solar farm in partnership with Duke Energy that provides energy for 1,200 households. We've done 1,500 free energy efficiency upgrades. There's not a lack of solutions. There's a lack of resources and recognition of what people are doing on the ground.
Yes.
That's the way that you ended. I think that's really it, right? You know, one thing that I've seen and what we're hearing from throughout the whole this afternoon is that the solutions are there. You know, everyone who's watching, you know, climate change is here and it's real, but the solutions are right here in our grasp. They are in communities like Florence, South Carolina. They're in communities like Sunset Park, Brooklyn, where both Elizabeth and Reverend Leo are. And while we're caught on time today with our conversation, I encourage you all to really continue this conversation. You know, I saw that Deidre had a question. What's the best way that folks can support? You know, there's a couple of ways. One thing, though, definitely check out the solutionsproject.org. There you can find a recap of all of, but not the episodes, but all of our grantees of the Solutions Project, like Elizabeth, like Reverend Leo, as well as find links to their websites where you can find out and support and donate to their organizations. You all, I just want to say thank you to my fabulous first guests of the first episode of Climate Curious. Elizabeth Yeampierre, Executive Director of UPROSE, Reverend Leo Woodberry, Executive Director of New Alpha, and actor Mark Ruffalo, as well as my fabulous sign language interpreter, Octavia Spiegel. Join me again next week, where we'll be talking about money, power, and energy, a little nod to the locks, money, power, and respect, about how to take control of power in the South. And joining us, we'll have Chandra Farley of Partnership of Southern Equity, as well as Michelle Moore from Groundswell. But that's all the time that we have today. Thank you all again to my guests. Thank you all to everyone who tuned in. I'm Shawnee Watkins of Agency of Joy, and this is Climate Curious. See you all next week. Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.
Man, great job, Sean.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
We're done with exploitation and extraction games, building a world apart from tragedy and